Hey guys, I'm Redeemed Zoomer, and today we're going to talk about 5 perspectives on how Christians should interact with the outside world. I'm going to briefly summarize them, then go more in depth. The first is called Christ against culture, which is that the world is bad, so we should separate ourselves from it. The second is Christ of culture, which is that the culture is good, so Christians should get along with it. The third is Christ above culture, where the outside world isn't necessarily good or bad. It has its place, but the church will always be better. So we should always value the church and Christian society above secular society. The fourth is Christ and culture in paradox, where every Christian lives in these two worlds, the Christian world and the secular world at the same time, and has to struggle with that tension between the two, but still try to be a good citizen of both. And the fifth is Christ the Redeemer of culture, where the outside world is bad, but it's the church's job to make it good. Okay, now let's talk about each of them. The first, Christ against culture, this is what the Christian fundamentalists believe. Most independent fundamental Baptists have this ideology. That the world is bad, it's just going to keep getting worse, so Christians should separate ourselves from it so we don't get polluted by it. The most extreme example of this idea are the Amish, of course. The Amish are so separate from the world, they won't even use any modern technology, I think. But it's not like there's going to be Amish people who watch this video and correct me on it, is there? The Amish are direct descendants of the Anabaptists, whereas Baptists are like indirect descendants. So the Amish are like the pure dark espresso of Anabaptists, and modern-day Baptists are sort of like diluted cafe Americano of the Anabaptists. But still, these ideas are prominent in Baptist circles, but they're prominent in all fundamentalist circles, so you will find fundamentalist Presbyterians, Lutherans, and even Catholics who hold to this idea. Fundamentalism was really popular in the 20th century when a lot of people believed in the rapture, which is that all Christians are going to get sucked off the earth before Christ comes back, and the world's just going to keep getting worse until then. So if the world's a sinking ship, it's not the church's job to transform the world, it's just the church's job to save individual souls to get off this horrible place, right? There are some early church people who believe this. A lot of the monastics, like the people who went off to live in monasteries in the early church, were like this. Because after Christianity became the state religion, a lot of people just became Christian because it was a cultural thing, and Christianity got a lot less pure. So some people wanted to live separately from everyone else to go back to the more pure Christianity from back when Christianity was more persecuted, and you were only Christian if you really meant it. But yeah, the fundamentalist mindset is deeply enshrined with this mindset and a lot of conservative retreatism, even in some non-Baptist denominations, even among Presbyterians, Anglicans, Lutherans. It's influenced by this idea that the culture is just going to keep getting worse, the world is bad, we should separate ourselves from it. All right, that's the Christ against culture mindset. So now the Christ of culture is the exact opposite perspective. If this was like the most fundamentalist mindset, this is the liberal Christian mindset. The only Christians who really believe this are liberal Christians. Liberal theology developed in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, which is basically atheism, but dressed in Christian language. It's a bunch of people who don't actually believe in God or any of the supernatural claims of Christianity, but they still think religion can be good for society. That's the difference between them and real atheists. I mean, they are atheists, but that's the difference between them and honest atheists. They believe religion can be good for society, so they think you can have the moral teachings of Christianity without any of the supernatural claims. Thomas Jefferson kind of held to this view, but it became more developed later on. So they just see Christ and religion as a projection of what humanity already believes. So they think humanity is basically good, and therefore culture is basically good. Humanity doesn't need any divine intervention from outside to fix it, because they don't believe there is any divine intervention. They believe Christ and God are just nice metaphors for love and social justice. So because of this, Christians should have no problem interacting with culture. Christians should just support whatever the culture supports. That's why if you go to a liberal mainline Protestant church, I am mainline Protestant, and a lot of mainline Protestant churches have this mindset. I don't, but many of them do. you'll very frequently, the sermon will just be like, be a good person, be good, love other people, and it's nothing more than that. And the church just supports whatever the culture supports. So these days, the churches a lot of times support LGBT ideology because the culture does. But back when the culture did not support that, the churches didn't support that either. So the church basically just goes along with the culture, with whatever the culture defines as good. So yeah, the Christ of culture mindset sees no conflict or contradiction between the church and the culture. I listened to a liberal pastor's sermon just last week. He was a PCUSA pastor. Now, I'm also PCUSA, but this guy was very liberal. And he thinks that there's a contradiction in the Bible. He thought that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke teach this because they tell Christians to go out into the world, but they think that the Gospel of John and the first epistle of John teaches this because the first epistle of John says Christians should not love the world. So this liberal pastor, he said that there's a contradiction in the Bible. Because how can these ideas be reconciled? I think they can be reconciled. And that's why there's 3 other perspectives. So the Christ above culture mindset, this is the classic Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and Reformed and Lutheran scholastic view, because Protestant scholasticism sort of reappropriated a lot of the ideas of medieval Catholicism, but within a Protestant context. So it sort of took the philosophical framework of medieval Catholicism, but translated it into Protestant theology. So the Christ above culture mindset believes strongly in natural law and a distinction between nature and grace. So nature is like the ways of this world, and grace is the ways of the world to come. Now, nature is not bad, but it's also not perfect. Grace and the ways of the world to come in Christianity is perfect. But Jesus hasn't come back yet. So right now, we do have to sort of deal with the way the world is, and it can't be changed. So that's why this mindset supports a lot of necessary evils, like hierarchy and the death penalty, and other ways of this world that we can't really change. So this ideology, the Christ above culture mindset, it doesn't have an optimistic or a pessimistic view of the outside world. It just has a realistic view of the outside world. Most people who hold this, actually I think everyone who holds to this, has an amillennial eschatology, where they think the history isn't getting better, it's not getting worse, the world's always going to be the same, there's nothing new under the sun, and the church's job is just to be faithful in that and enforce natural law. What is natural law? Well, there's this idea, because of this nature-grace distinction, which Thomas Aquinas talks about a lot, that there are general moral truths that everyone of any religion can realize just from nature. Certain moral truths you don't need to know about the Bible or Jesus to know them. All cultures pretty much agree stealing is wrong. All cultures pretty much agree murder is wrong. All cultures traditionally believe marriage is between a man and a woman. So people like Thomas Aquinas and the Reformed scholastics would say, these aren't necessarily from Scripture. I mean, Scripture affirms these ideas, but they really just come from natural law. So yeah, this is a very popular mindset. Most Catholics have held to this mindset, and a lot of Protestants as well, too. So this is actually a very popular mindset in historic Christianity. Now we get to Christ and culture in paradox. Martin Luther might have held to this view, but this view is like so similar to the previous view, it's kind of hard to tell. And a lot of modern evangelicals like Tim Keller claims to hold to one of the other views, but I think he actually holds to this view in practice. It's basically like the previous view, where there's nature and grace, there's the Christian world and the secular world. But unlike the previous view, it doesn't really think the church should have any control over the secular world. Like the previous view thinks it's sort of the church's job to help enforce natural law and to help enforce just a common goodness. But this view doesn't necessarily think so. This view thinks Christians should only live in the secular world by being good on an individual basis, by loving their neighbors well. So you've heard that it's like, oh, it's not the church's job to be political. We want our sermons to be gospel-centered, not politics-centered. So the only view of all 5 that has ever really said the church should stay out of politics is this view. So I should have started with that instead of giving you all this like complex jargon that I barely understand. If you hear a pastor say church shouldn't be political, they hold to this view. Every other view would disagree. The first view would say, yes, the church should be political. It says to stay away from the evils of the world. The second view it would say, yes, the church should be political. It should support liberalism. The third view would say, yes, the church should be political. It should support natural law. So if you ever hear anyone say, oh, I follow Jesus, not politics, this is the view they hold to. It is a very modern thing to say the church shouldn't be political. The church has always been political, okay? Now, saying the church has been political does not mean the church should make an alliance with a particular political party. But whenever Christianity has not been horribly persecuted, it has always been relevant to politics. Why? Because religion is always relevant to politics. Why? Because politics is downstream from culture, and culture is downstream from religion. So it sounds nice to say, oh, I'm not a political Christian. It's also a fantasy, right? It's not a very historically informed position. So the fifth view is Christ the Redeemer of culture. So there's a lot of different people who've held to this view. I think John Calvin did. Abraham Kuyper definitely did. In fact, Kuyper's held to this view so strongly, sometimes this view is called Kuyperianism. Abraham Kuyper was a Dutch Reformed thinker. This is very common in Calvinism and Reformed theology. Now, not all Reformed people have held to this view, because a lot of Reformed people have also held to the third view, because they're like Reformed scholastics. Now, this view, usually it's post-millennial. Not always. There's some amillennials, like me, who hold to this view. But basically, it says that the outside world is bad, is pretty bad, and maybe there's some sort of natural law, but it's the church's job to actually transform culture and make it better. And people who hold to this view will say, hey, look, the church abolished slavery. William Wilberforce, English Calvinist, abolished the slave trade in England. And they'll say the church has actually done more for the elevation of women in society than any other religion. Like, nowadays people think Christianity is like this super sexist, backwards religion. Okay, if you compare Christianity to every other ancient culture and religion, it was radical in how much it elevated women. Roman pagans made fun of Christianity. They mocked it by calling it the religion of women and slaves. So keep that in mind next time you think the purpose of Christianity is to be as based and trad and right-wing as possible. Okay? But this basically believes that the church should transform culture, that the church actually redeems culture, the church can actually change culture and make it better. Right? Another more liberal person who held to this is Jürgen Moltmann. He believed that the church can transform culture, but he put a more liberal spin on what transforming culture looks like. So whereas more conservative people who hold to this view will say, yeah, the church should transform culture to make it like a based Christian society. More liberal people who hold to this view will say, oh yeah, the church should make the world into like a secular, not a secular, but the church should make the world into a social justice utopia. And this is the view I hold to. And these 5 categories come from Richard Niebuhr, who's a 20th century theologian, very influential theologian, along with his brother Reynold Niebuhr. Now, I don't think either of the Niebuhr brothers really believed in all this stuff, but they were really scholars of how Christianity impacts culture. And I think regardless of whether they were truly saved, which, if they didn't believe in Christ, if they didn't believe Christ is real, there's a good chance they weren't, they still have good insights. And I believe, because I'm not a Donatist, I believe that all truth is God's truth, and we should pick up good insights wherever we find them. Thanks for watching this, guys, and I'll see you all later.